I remember when I was a kid, maybe like 7 or 8 years old, and I was angry at my mom. And I don't remember why I was angry. Probably I didn't get what I wanted, some nonsense like that. But I was really angry with her. And we were in the house, and she called out for me, and I said, "What?" And time stood still, and the earth stopped moving. And my mom is a strong black woman, and I won't tell you what happened next. I will say I never spoke like that to her again. Has anyone here seen the show Friends? Friends. Has anyone watched the show Friends? Okay, a couple people. This was a risk. So I'm glad we got a couple people in the house. So Friends was an incredibly popular TV show in the 90s and the early 2000s. And it had an incredible following at that time. And honestly, it still does today. One of the reasons is that they had an incredible cast. They had interesting storylines. It was funny. But one of the things that kept people engaged in the show for 9 seasons is that if they did not introduce it, they at least perfected the will they, won't they dynamic with characters in TV. That dynamic is when you got two characters and you're not sure if they're going to get together or stay apart, or if they're going to get back together or stay apart. And the two characters in Friends that danced around this dynamic for 9 seasons was Ross Geller and Rachel Green. If you didn't know, they do get together in the end. If that's a spoiler, it's been 20 years. So I do not take responsibility for that in any capacity. I remember watching the show, and I would be disgruntled, aggravated, befuddled by the way these two characters, Ross and Rachel, would interact with each other in this will they, won't they dance. Sometimes they'd be fine, even cordial. Sometimes they would be jealous of one another, but oftentimes they would argue. And I would look at their arguments, and I would get frustrated. I'd be like, this would be so much easier if you learned how to communicate. This would be so much easier if you learned how to interact with each other in a healthy way. This would be so much easier if you learned wise ways to engage with one another. As we introduced this series last week, we said the book of James is full of practical wisdom in this book. It has many different sayings and teachings that cover all sorts of topics of life, but they come back to being centered around loving and living for Jesus. And of the many teaching that is found in the book of James, a teaching I think would have been very beneficial for Ross and Rachel, and a teaching that would even be more beneficial for us, is how to engage others with wisdom. Today our message centers around what God has to say, the wisdom in the Word when it comes to engaging with others with wisdom. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Short verse, we're going to read it one more time. It says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. I don't know about y'all, I think that would have been great for Ross and Rachel in their dance for 9 years. I also think it's essential for us in how we engage with other people. The thing about this verse is it's not just talking about how to engage with others, but it's talking about how to do so with wisdom. That tagline, with wisdom, is important because, as we all know, there are a ton of different ways we can engage with other people. There are a ton of different things we can say. There are a ton of different things that we can do. But if we want to do so with wisdom, we have this essential yet simple principle on what that looks like. That when it comes to engaging with others, the wisdom that God is imparting to us is to be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. We know that this is good, we know that it's helpful, but part of the reason why we know it's so helpful is because we know what it's like when someone does not act out of the wisdom that God gives us. We know what it's like when someone will not listen to you, and you're trying to tell them something, you're trying to express something to them, and they're not hearing you. We know what that's like. We know what it's like when you're trying to be speaking in a sentence or in a conversation and someone keeps interrupting you. We know what it's like when someone says something, whether intentionally or unintentionally, that really hurts you and harms you. We know what it's like to be around people who are very angry or have a short fuse. We've experienced the anger of others. So we know the inverse of the wisdom that God is imparting to us. But we also know what it's like when someone practices the wisdom that God is imparting to us. We know what it's like when someone listens to you and as they're expressing something that's deep and heavy on your heart and mind and how valuable that is. We know what it's like when someone assumes a patient presence and they just allow you to be yourself. But we know what it's like when someone carefully chooses the words they're going to say to you instead of just blurting out whatever's on their mind. We know it's valuable. So because we know the importance of this principle, because we know that God has imparted this to us intentionally, and because we know what it feels like, we've experienced it ourselves, these are the principles that we ought to use in interacting with others. The first thing we're advised to do in interacting with others with wisdom is this: to be quick to listen. The first point, quick to listen. Being quick to listen. This might be a little difficult for the yappers in the room and online. And I'm up there with y'all. You give me enough caffeine, I can yap with the best of them, right? But this verse right here, it's not necessarily condoning the person who talks a lot. It's not just trying to give you conversation skills to sharpen, but it's getting at assuming a posture in which others can be heard. In reflection of this, we may need to ask ourselves this question: do I have a presence? Am I a person that assumes a posture in which other people can be heard? Am I a person that allows other people to be heard? I think listening is becoming a lost art in our day and age. And it doesn't have to be. And the interesting thing is that I think most people want to be heard. Most people want to be heard in what they have to say and what they're thinking, but very few people want to stay long enough to listen to what other people have to say. And I think that's interesting. And it's not to point fingers or to be judgmental, but it's to encourage our own introspection that many of us want to be heard, but few of us will stay to listen and be quick to do so. It might be really eye-opening if we look at our conversations, and I mean really look at our conversations and see how many times do I interrupt a person when they're speaking? Or how many times is someone telling me something and then I start talking about myself? Or how many times am I in a conversation and I'm listening so I know what to say next as opposed to listening to hear what they have to say and be present with them in that moment? Think about how our arguments might change, or how our arguments might not even have the space to become arguments if we were quick to listen. Think about conflict management and how well we can engage that if we were first quick to listen. Think about how cared for and loved people might feel when you give them the time and space to listen to what they have to say. Even think about the last time that someone really listened to what you had to say. Maybe you're in your feelings, you're feeling some type of way, and you just needed someone to hear you. Think about that last time that someone really listened to you and how that felt. Second thing we see in the word in verse 19 is to be slow to speak. First, we are to be quick to listen. The second thing in interacting with others is to be slow to speak. Can y'all remember the last time you said something that got you in trouble? And what happened? You probably spoke a little too soon, didn't you? That's probably what happened. I remember when I was a kid, maybe like 7 or 8 years old, and I was angry at my mom. And I don't remember why I was angry. Probably I didn't get what I wanted, some nonsense like that. But I was really angry with her. And we were in the house, and she called out for me, and I said, "What?" And time stood still, and the earth stopped moving. And my mom is a strong black woman, and I won't tell you what happened next. I will say I never spoke like that to her again. We might be surprised how much trouble we can keep ourselves out of by being slow to speak. We might be surprised how much trouble we can keep ourselves out of by being slow to react or being slow to respond. And here's what being slow to speak helps us do. It helps us distinguish between helpful words and harmful words. In being quick to speak, we may not give ourselves enough time to distinguish what is helpful and what is harmful, but slowing down gives us space to make the distinction between the two. There's this study that showed it takes roughly 600 milliseconds for a thought to become a word. 600 milliseconds from the time it takes for you to think of something to say, for you to actually say it. And if you're wondering, that's really fast. It's really, really fast. And this principle of being slow to speak says this: it takes only 600 milliseconds for you to say something you can't take back. Sometimes we speak because we're nervous and we don't know what to say. But we might be surprised how powerful silence and presence actually is. When it comes to dealing with people in grief, sometimes we feel like we need to say something. We need to say the right things, but we might be surprised how sometimes when you're in grief, words aren't good. They don't help. But silence and presence is better. When a person is sharing something that is on their heart, they're expressing something deep, sometimes your words, what you have to say, is not what they need. But a time of silence and listening is beneficial. In the midst of an argument, when the temptation is to return word for word, sometimes being slow to speak is one of the greatest gifts you can give a person, even when they're upset with you. Sometimes taking the time to process what another person is saying to you means so much to that person because it shows that you care enough about what they're sharing that you want to sit with it and make sure you respond in a way that is beneficial and helpful and loving. Third thing we see is this. The third thing is to become slow to become angry. Slow to become angry. This is really interesting, and I think in order to grasp the fullness of the text and what exactly he means when he says this, we need to develop this fuller understanding and dive into verse 20. So we'll start in verse 19 and go to verse 20. It says this: "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires." This might be a hot take, controversial opinion. I don't think anger is a bad emotion. I don't think anger is a wrong emotion. But it can be when it's human anger. Human anger is an anger in which God does not have the space to meet us in. When God does not have the space to meet us in our anger, that is when it becomes wrong, because it says human anger does not produce the righteousness that he desires. That's a big distinction. Anger is not a bad emotion. It has a tendency to be destructive in human hands. So when the word says be slow to anger, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires, it's pointing out this tendency for us to take this neutral emotion and use it for destruction instead of construction. Human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. One thing that's helped me understand anger and how it's not is the way that God engages with anger in the Word, especially in the Old Testament. There are many times when God is angry, and he's angry because of the wickedness of the people, and there are times when God is pouring out his wrath on people because of the different things that they were doing. But God being angry and pouring out his wrath was not him throwing a temper tantrum. God being angry and pouring out his wrath was not because he didn't know how to handle his emotions well, so he just reverted to anger. God being angry and pouring out wrath wasn't this chaotic expression of what he was feeling, but it was righteous and it was good. It corrected evil and wrongdoing. It turned people back to him. One place we see this is in Jeremiah, where God sends out the prophet Jeremiah to tell the people, y'all, the wrath of God is coming. And it does. But it demonstrates his care. It demonstrates God's care and attentiveness to how people are responding and treating one another and how it's not right. It demonstrates his care that people are turning from him instead of turning away from him, and that's not good. And sometimes it's the wrath of God that brings people back to him. It was constructive. Our anger can be constructive. There is a space in our anger in which it produces the righteousness that God desires. There are things that we can and we should be angry about. But we should use our anger constructively to build things, to right wrongs, to build up people and systems, as opposed to using our anger solely to tear them down and destroy people and hurt people and harm people. So anger can be good, but oftentimes the way we express it is not. Before we move on, I believe it's essential that we understand not all anger is explosive. But the temptation we can have is taking this association of explosive anger and assuming this is solely what James is talking about in this text. But that's not it. Sometimes anger isn't explosive, it's passive-aggressive, where a person is addressing something, but at the same time, they're not addressing that thing. Sometimes anger is silence and distance, where we may say, I will not yell at you, but I will punish you by my absence. Sometimes anger is the slow boiling under the surface that comes to a head at one point or another and creates this bitterness. Sometimes anger is the stubbornness of I will not move. There are many ways in which we can express anger, but despite the expressions of anger, the encouragement the word gives is the same, to be slow to it. Furthermore, we see in the word that God himself, that he has times when he's angry, but this dominant characteristic is that he's slow to it. See, in Psalm 145, verse 8, it says this, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. God is angry. He has times when he is angry, but even he is slow to it. So when we receive this invitation to be slow to anger, we also receive this invitation to look more like God. We conclude our verses in verse 21. It says this, it says, therefore, because of all this, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. You know, the first couple times I was reading that verse, I was really confused by it. And I felt like this is kind of random. It seems a little sporadic. It seems very intense at the same time. Seems kind of out of place. But what this verse is doing is it's surmising and encouraging us that because of the wisdom in the way that we engage with others, because we are to be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry, because of the goodness of this concept, this principle, we need to remove that from ourselves that would keep us from practicing this. And the Bible is giving us the same encouragement that in order to lean into the wisdom that is present in the Word, when it comes to engaging others wisely, to take off the moral filth, take off the corruption, take off the evil desires, take off this selfishness, take off the wrong that is so present in the world, and to put on clothes that honor and reflect this walk with God. James is encouraging us not only to turn from these things and to turn to being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, but to do so intensely that whatever contrasts with this principle is fully rejected by ourselves. When it comes to these three principles, quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry, I think the temptation is I just have to remember this. Like I just have to put it on a Post-it. I just have to put it on my wall and just remember that I need to do these things. And that could be helpful. That could be true. But I believe a better way to incorporate these things into our lives is by continuing to cultivate this walk with Jesus. That we could try to do it with our human effort. We could try to say, I have these three things to remember, and we may get some success. But when it comes to living this, when it comes to practicing this, ingraining this into our being, it comes from a deeper walk with Jesus than a couple notes on a Post-it note. It comes with continuing or starting this deep journey of faith by walking with God, where God is not just our Savior and the one who saved us by grace, but where He is our Lord, where He has permission and authority to remove things within ourselves that are not honoring and good to Him. It's this dynamic where, like as if He's a master gardener who's tending the soil, He has permission to remove the rocks, remove the bad things, to cultivate something good. It comes from cultivating this deep walk with Jesus. And one way we can do this is by turning to His Word instead of turning from it. And even listening to the wisdom that He has given us in this book to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry.